If there's one thing I've learned over the years working in the police, it's that some people have a special talent for turning any normal situation into a scandal. They live for the drama, for the feeling of power, for the pleasure of bossing others around. And, believe me, few people master this art better than a certain specific type of HOA president. I've never been one to get involved in neighborhood politics. When I bought my house in this nice, organized community, I just wanted peace and quiet. Working as a sheriff gave me enough of a migraine, so the last thing I wanted was to fight over silly things like the height of the grass or the color of the fence. But, as it turned out, keeping the peace in my own home was too optimistic. Because, from the moment I moved in, the HOA, or rather, the creature that proclaimed itself the queen of the neighborhood, decided that I wasn't the kind of resident who fit the pattern. The first implication came in the very first week. I had just come home from work and left my truck parked in the driveway. I didn't even have time to close the door before I heard someone clearing their throat loud enough to be a human microphone. When I looked down at the sidewalk, there she was, her blonde hair perfectly set in a spray-on helmet, a notebook of impromptu finds in her hand, and the look on her face like she was about to throw unsolicited rules in my face. "You know, sir," she began, tilting her head as if she were a teacher, trying to teach a 5-year-old, "We have strict rules about vehicles. Old trucks give the wrong impression to the neighborhood." I had to hold back my laughter. My truck might not be a luxury sports car, but calling it old was an exaggeration. Not to mention that, as far as I knew, legal and registered vehicles could be parked in the driveways of their respective houses without needing a stamp of approval from the local dictator. I took a deep breath, smiled, and went into the house without saying anything. After all, there was no point in wasting energy arguing with someone who clearly didn't have a real job to worry about. But that was just the beginning. Over the next few months, the harassment began to take shape. Little things, at first. Made-up fines would mysteriously appear in my mailbox. Warnings about inadequate maintenance of the facade of the house, even though it was spotless. Complaints about suspicious noises coming from my property, when the only thing making noise there was the damn wind. The climax was when I decided to build a small shed at the back of the yard to store equipment. I took out all the necessary permits and followed the city's rules to the letter. But apparently following the law meant nothing when you had an HOA determined to destroy you. The day after the work began, I received a formal email informing me that the construction was unacceptable and should be demolished immediately. The reason? None valid. Just the traditional, "It's not in keeping with the aesthetics of the neighborhood." That's when I realized that this woman wasn't going to stop until she got what she wanted. And what did she want? To kick me out of the neighborhood? Now, you're probably wondering, why does an HOA want to get rid of a single resident so badly? The answer is simple: power. It was a question of territorial dominance. I didn't bend to their rules. I didn't care about the neighborhood status games. I didn't tremble at the base when someone said to me, "That goes against HOA guidelines." And that drove her crazy, except she couldn't just take me away. So, what better way to do that? Make me a problem. Paint me as a threat to the neighborhood. Create a narrative in which I was a walking danger that needed to be removed. And that's exactly what she did. It was on a random Wednesday that things escalated to a completely insane level. I was off work and decided to take the opportunity to clean out the garage. I had left some boxes on the sidewalk while I organized everything when I saw, out of the corner of my eye, her figure standing on the corner, just watching. It was always like that. She never did anything directly, always spying, always trying to find something she could use against me. I ignored it. I carried on with my work. Less than an hour later, 2 police cars arrived in the street. Sirens off, but lights flashing. 3 officers got out of the vehicles, hands in their holsters, serious as if they had just arrived at a crime scene. I frowned. What the hell is going on here? I thought. That's when I saw her leaving the house and going to meet the officers with the best theatrical performance I've ever seen. Hands on her chest, the expression of someone who has just witnessed an unspeakable horror. Voice trembling. He's been acting very strangely. I'm worried about the safety of the neighborhood. I had to stop myself from laughing right then and there. One of the officers, who, by the way, worked for me, looked at me, then at her, then at me again, clearly trying to understand how someone could be so stupid. I already knew what had happened. She called 911 and made up a story that her mysterious neighbor was behaving in a worrisome manner. A report vague enough to warrant the police showing up. The point is, she didn't know who I was. She didn't even bother to find out who lived next door before calling the police. So what now? Now I wanted to see how she was going to get out of it. Because, at that moment, she hadn't just called the police to arrest some random neighbor. She had called the police to arrest the town sheriff. And I wasn't going to let that pass. If there's one show I like to watch, it's the moment when a person realizes, too late, that they've made the worst mistake of their life. And that afternoon, I had the privilege of witnessing it in real time. I stood there in my driveway as 3 officers, my subordinates, tried to figure out why on earth they had been called to a non-existent incident. The most experienced officer in the group, Lewis, looked me up and down. "Chief?" he asked in a confused tone, tilting his head. I made a discreet gesture with my hand, asking for patience. I wanted to see how far that woman was going to go with this crazy thing, and, my friend, she went far. She still had that dramatic expression, as if she was about to faint from panic. I tried to warn you before it was too late," she said theatrically, her voice shaking. "But he won't listen. He's hanging around the neighborhood at odd hours, leaving things on the sidewalk, behaving in a threatening way." I swear, I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing. Lewis looked at me, then at the boxes I was organizing in the garage. The most inoffensive scene possible. "How threatening?" he asked, trying, with all the professionalism in the world, to give the situation some seriousness. "He brings guns home. I saw it with my own eyes. That's not normal for a residential neighborhood." Ah, now it is. Now it was clear what she was trying to do. She saw me unloading service equipment and thought it was her big chance to turn me into public enemy #1. There was a problem with that plan. Of course. I'm the town sheriff. It's obvious that I have guns. That's part of my job. I took a deep breath, still holding in my laughter. "Let me get this straight," I began, crossing my arms. "You called the police because you saw a policeman taking police equipment home?" She blinked a few times, as if her brain was desperately trying to find a way out. "It's not about that," she stammered. "It's about community safety, rules. This neighborhood doesn't need someone like him around." Her voice faltered at the end of the sentence. She realized. She finally understood. The 3 policemen, who until then had been trying not to laugh in her face, changed their posture. Their faces became serious, because now it was no longer just an absurd accusation. Now she had admitted her true intention. She just wanted to get rid of me. Lewis cleared his throat and stepped forward. "Ma'am, are you saying that you called 911 to try to remove a resident who, as far as we know, has committed no crime?" His tone changed. Now it was no longer confused. Now it was official. The woman took a step back, realizing that perhaps she had gone too far. I just wanted to protect the neighborhood," she muttered. Lewis looked at me, as if asking silently, "What do you want me to do?" I thought I'd just call it a day. It could have been another normal day, another senseless interference by an HOA that thinks it owns the world. But no, I wasn't going to let it go. Not after months of this woman trying to make my life a living hell. "Lewis, how much is the fine for false reports to 911? I asked casually. Her eyes widened. "It depends on the person's history," he replied, picking up his notepad. "But since this is the 3rd time we've received an unfounded call from her, I think we can start with $1,000. The HOA choked on air. "What? Oh, and of course, I continued, ignoring her indignation. I think the city's legal department will be thrilled to know that an HOA is trying to use emergency services for personal harassment. If she seemed nervous before, now you could see the desperation screaming across her face. She tried to argue. I didn't do anything illegal. I just filed a complaint. Lewis sighed. No, ma'am. You abused the emergency services for something that clearly wasn't an emergency. That costs time, money, and can delay real calls. The other two officers started filling in the ticket right there while she tried to justify herself. But it was too late. The punishment had already been handed down. Now, all that was missing was the icing on the cake. Neighbors started coming out of their houses, attracted by the noise and the flashing lights. Some were already holding up their cell phones, filming everything, and that's when the final blow came. Mrs. Gonzalez, who lived in the front house and had always been so nice to me, appeared at the gate. "What's this woman up to now?" she asked, loud enough for everyone to hear. The HOA turned to her, red with anger. "I'm protecting the neighborhood," she shouted. "This man is dangerous." Mrs. Gonzalez let out a short laugh. "Honey, he's the sheriff." And then the whole neighborhood burst out laughing. The scene was ridiculous. The residents laughing, the cops finishing the ticket, and the HOA standing there, looking like it wanted to dig a hole in the ground and disappear. When we finished, I handed her the paper with a smile. "Here it is. Don't forget to pay on time, or the fine will double." She took the paper with trembling hands. She didn't reply. She just looked around, seeing that no one else was by her side. And that was the exact moment when she realized that her war against me was over. But mine had only just begun. You know that feeling of deep satisfaction when justice is done right in front of you? Well, that was my moment. The supreme queen of the HOA was standing there, holding up the $1,000 fine with trembling fingers, while the neighbors laughed on the sidewalks. The police officers she herself called were finishing filling out reports, and Mrs. Gonzalez, that wonderful lady, was already telling half the neighborhood what had just happened. The scene couldn't have been more perfect, but the HOA? Well, she hadn't given up yet. After an awkward silence, the woman finally raised her head and looked directly at me. Her eyes were red with anger. Her mouth was trembling, and I saw when she made her decision. If she was going to fall, she was going to try to take me with her. And that's how her final gamble began. The next day, I went to work as usual. The sheriff of a small town doesn't get a break, but I was in a great mood. Nothing like seeing a neighborhood tyrant get a reality check first thing in the morning. But around noon, my phone rang. "Chief, I think you need to come down here." It was Lewis, the same officer who had been with me at the mess the day before. And from the tone of his voice, I knew there was bullshit coming. "What happened now?" I asked, reaching for my car keys. The HOA just showed up at the police station." He paused, as if trying to hold in his laughter. "And she brought a lawyer." Now I was curious. I arrived at the police station and immediately saw her unmistakable figure sitting in one of the reception chairs, tapping her heels impatiently on the floor. Next to her, a man in a suit, hair slicked back, holding a folder of documents as if it were a trophy. When I entered, she gave me a triumphant look. Ah, so that was it. She still thought she could beat me through sheer bluff. I approached the counter and crossed my arms. "Right, ma'am. What can I do for you?" The lawyer cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and began to speak with the tone of someone who thinks he has a card up his sleeve. "My client came here today to file a formal complaint against you, Sheriff." I let out a little smile. "Is that so?" The HOA took the lead. "That's right. You're using your position to harass me, intimidate me, and apply undue sanctions." I held back my laughter. This woman's audacity knew no bounds. "Harass me?" I repeated, feigning confusion. "Can you remind me who called the police to arrest a neighbor without knowing he was the sheriff?" The lawyer cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. He flipped through the papers, trying to keep his composure. "Regardless of the circumstances, my client feels that she is being unfairly persecuted. Oh, right. The woman who had spent months fining me for breathing in the neighborhood now felt persecuted. Lewis, who was standing next to me, feigned a cough to disguise a laugh. "And what exactly do you want us to do?" I asked, really curious to see how far she was going to take this clowning. The lawyer took a deep breath and launched into the big demand. "We want the fine withdrawn immediately, and for you to issue a public declaration that you acted in good faith." I swear I would have laughed out loud if I'd been in a bar. But there, I just smiled. "So, let me get this straight," I began, tilting my head. "You want me to forgive the fine for making a false report, and also publicly apologize for fining you?" "Exactly!" She crossed her arms, as if she were cornering me. It was my turn to laugh. "Ma'am, that fine was imposed in accordance with the law. False reports cost money, time, and can delay real emergencies. If you want to contest it, you can follow the legal procedures like any other citizen." The lawyer tried to argue, but I continued. "And about that public statement," I smiled. "Let's just say that I don't think you want any more attention for this case than you've already had." Her eyes narrowed. "It's not over, Sheriff." "Good. I don't think so either." And with that, I turned and went back to my office. But she was right. It wasn't over yet, and her downfall was going to be much worse than a simple fine. 2 days later, the big turning point happened. The HOA, desperate not to lose its precious power, made the ultimate mistake. It started threatening its own neighbors. Now that it knew I wasn't leaving the neighborhood anytime soon, it decided that if it couldn't kick me out, it would purge anyone who was on my side. She started sending letters to some of the older residents, saying that their fences were not up to standard, and that they would be sued if they didn't make the adjustments within 7 days. One neighbor, a single mother, received a warning that she was disturbing the order of the neighborhood because her children were playing in the street. And the worst thing? She started collecting fake fines to try to cover her own debt from the fine she had received from the police. But it backfired, because this time nobody was afraid of her anymore. In less than a week, the HOA was inundated with formal complaints. Residents began to organize. Some people filed lawsuits against the association. And the big blow came when the HOA's vice president, a man who was clearly only there out of duty, publicly resigned, claiming that he could no longer condone abuses of power. Within days, the community went into a state of revolt. The HOA lost most of its board members. The remaining group collapsed, trying to maintain control. And then came the big news. The neighborhood held an emergency vote to remove the HOA altogether. Yes, that's right. The entire neighborhood decided that it was better to live without an HOA than to spend another second under that woman's command. When the results came out, I made a point of going to her house just to deliver an official copy of the decision. She opened the door, expecting another fight. But this time, there was nothing more she could do. "Congratulations. You've done it. It's over." I handed her the paper with a smile. She grabbed it with trembling hands, read it, and, for the first time, was speechless. She simply shut the door in my face. And that's how the woman who tried to throw me out lost everything. But honestly, she didn't need the HOA anymore. Because after that public humiliation, I doubt she'd have the courage to move out so soon. If I thought the story ended there, well, I underestimated this woman's level of stubbornness. She couldn't accept defeat in a dignified manner. She didn't come to terms with the destruction of the HOA and move on with her life as any reasonable person would. She decided that if she was going to go down, she was going to take as many people with her as possible. And the main target? It was still me. A few days after the HOA officially ceased to exist, I started hearing rumors that it was up to something. Neighbors told strange stories. One saw the woman talking to a lawyer in the neighborhood coffee shop. Another noticed that she had spent hours printing documents at the stationery store. And a third, a retired man who spent half the day watching the street go by, told me something very curious. She's been calling reporters. Now that intrigued me, because when a tyrant loses his throne, he only has two options. Either he accepts the end and retires, or he tries to manipulate the narrative to come out as a victim. And guess which option she chose? Her plan was brilliantly dumb. She decided to give an interview to a local blog, telling her version of events. And, my friend, it was a spectacle of lies. The headline was already ridiculous. Sheriff removes woman from her own home using abuse of power. Yes, that's right. The woman who had spent months stalking me, fining me and calling the police on me for no reason, now wanted the world to believe that I was the villain in the story. In the article, she claimed that I had bullied her, manipulated the neighbors against her, and destroyed her position in the HOA out of pure personal revenge. The icing on the cake? She said that after everything I had done, she no longer felt safe in her own home. Seriously, the woman who stalked me for no reason now wanted to play the victim. Now, a normal man might let it go. Maybe I could just ignore it, get on with my life, and let time erase that nonsense. But I happened to be very, very stubborn, and that was the last straw. Because if she wanted a public war, then she was going to have one. That same week, I decided to get in touch with a real journalist, a guy I'd known for years, one of those who won't swallow any dramatic story without investigating it first. I sent him a short message. If you want the real story about the HOA, I think you'll like it here. I attached documents, the fake fines she issued to her neighbors, the complaints she made against me, the police record showing that she abused the emergency services to harass me. In less than 24 hours, he called me. That's pure gold. And then, her house started to fall down. The journalist published everything. Not only did it disprove every accusation she made against me, it exposed all the dirt she'd gotten up to while running the HOA. The article destroyed any chance of her coming off as a victim. Neighbors shared the article like fire on dry straw. The comments were a massacre. She tried to put out the fire. She rushed to social media. She tried to play the wronged party. But no one was falling for her lies anymore. The whole town knew who she really was, and the shame was so great that she simply disappeared. The following month, her house was put up for sale. She couldn't bear to stay there after the public humiliation. The neighbors, who had previously been afraid of her, now passed in front of the house and laughed. The empire she had built up with her tyranny had turned to dust. And what about me? Well, I carried on living my life. My garage was still organized. My truck was still in the driveway. And now I could finally enjoy my home without being treated like a criminal in my own neighborhood. Months later, a new resident bought her house, a nice retired man who just wanted some peace and quiet. One day, while I was tending to the garden, he came over to the fence and started talking. The previous owner of this house was a problem, wasn't he? I let out a short laugh. You have no idea. He looked around, took a deep breath, and smiled. Well, I think now this neighborhood can finally have peace. And, my friend, for the first time in a long time, I agreed. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like.